Welcome back to the first lecture in Period 3. This is lecture number 16, topic 3.1, Contextualizing Period 3. This lecture is meant to give you all of the background information or the context for everything that's going to happen between 1754 and 1800. That will include the French and Indian War, the American War for Independence, and the early Republic. The learning objective is explain the context in which America gained independence and developed a sense of national identity. The first key concept is British attempts to assert tighter control over its North American colonies and the colonial resolve to pursue self-government led to a colonial independence movement and the Revolutionary War. The end of salutary neglect, which was Britain ignoring its colonies and leaving them to manage themselves, is over after the French and Indian War. This war was fought partially in North America and it required tremendous amounts of resources. The British were looking to replenish their treasuries from their expenses on the war, and they're looking for tax revenue. Several revenue acts are placed on the colonies, and it gives rise to the independence movement. The colonies will be especially offended by the revenue acts as they had enjoyed some of the lowest tax burden across the British Empire. Additionally, they will be limited in their expansion to newly won territories to prevent conflicts with Native Americans. Maintaining the army in the colonies to protect colonists from native resistance to encroachment was expensive, and Parliament had no appetite to keep it going. In response to the taxes and limitations placed on them, colonists demand direct representation in Parliament as an ultimatum. In other words, give us a say in the policies imposed on the colonies, or don't expect us to follow those policies. When Parliament denies that representation, the independence movement grows stronger. Some of the examples that show this distaste for the greater imperial control are Patrick Henry in the Virginia House of Burgesses making his "Give me liberty or give me death" speech. On the screen, there's also an example of the stamps that the Stamp Act would require colonists to have on all of their documents. The next key concept is the competition among the British, French, and American Indians for economic and political advantage in North America culminated in the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War, in which Britain defeated France and allied with American Indians. The cause of the 7 Years' War was a territorial dispute in the Ohio River Valley. George Washington, who was a young lieutenant in the Virginia Regiment or militia, was sent out to the Ohio River Valley near present-day Pittsburgh to tell the French to stop building fortifications there and to leave. The French at Fort Duquesne brushed him off, told him to get lost. These diplomatic proceedings turned violent when an American Indian in Washington's party kills a French emissary. Washington was heavily outnumbered and outgunned and signed a surrender of the territory, which forced Britain to send troops to reestablish their claims to the territory. Eventually, there's going to be a British victory despite a slow start. Their strategy takes them through French Canada, and when they capture Quebec, it leads to the French surrender. The next key concept, the desire of many colonists to assert ideals of self-government in the face of renewed British imperial efforts, led to a colonial independence movement and war with Britain. After the French and Indian War was over, the British started to impose those imperial taxes on the colonies to pay the war debts and limitations on expansion. The first in a series of taxes passed to repay for the war expense was the Stamp Act of 1765. It required a royal stamp to be attached to any legal document or printed material. As it was the first one placed on the colonists, it draws the most ire and organized boycotts. The colonists mobilized and even carried out acts of violence against the tax collectors. The reaction was so strong that Parliament repealed the act before it even took effect. In 1763, the British set the Proclamation Line of 1763. It kept colonists from moving further out west to prevent wars with Native Americans. The cause for such a policy was a coordinated attack across the west on British forts by allied American Indian groups called Pontiac's Rebellion. The policy angered colonists since they had just fought a war to expel the French from that territory. Colonists resist these taxes and resist the Proclamation Line of 1763, at first with some success. They get the Stamp Act of 1765 repealed through boycotts and petitions, but later on the Crown and Parliament will have less sympathy for the rebellious colonists. The next key concept, the American Revolution's democratic and republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. The first type of government that is established in the former British colonies after independence is a republic. It is constituted through the Articles of Confederation, which were ratified in 1783, just a couple months before the American victory at Yorktown. It is significant that the process of agreeing on a form of government lasted almost as long as the fighting itself. It means that despite the consensus for independence, agreeing on a form of government was not a given. After the Declaration of Independence, each state government drafted its own constitution that severed ties with Britain. Through the Revolution, the Second Continental Congress acted as a unicameral body that directed the war effort with the help of the state governments. The Articles of Confederation created a weak central government and left it impotent to address larger problems. In 1789, the U.S. Constitution is adopted to fix the problems that the Articles could not address, namely issues of taxation, common defense, the economy, and many others. In the new Constitution, a federal system was established in which states retained sovereignty in certain areas, but a central government was given supremacy over most areas. On the screen you see the seal of the state of Virginia surrounded by their motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, and a visual of Caesar being slain. It shows disdain and distrust for one person holding absolute power in government. For this reason, all forms of government that were implemented limited concentrated power, either by instituting checks and balances or not granting it altogether. The next key concept says the ideals that inspire the revolutionary cause reflected new beliefs about politics, religion, and society that had been developing over the course of the 18th century. This key concept highlights the continuities between the previous colonial period and the current revolutionary period. It says that all of the ideals that flourished in this period could not have happened without the political, religious, and societal developments of the 17th and early 18th century. In terms of politics, the ideals for self-government, the Enlightenment ideals of the social contract are present in both periods. Locke writes extensively about it in the previous period, and in 1776, Thomas Paine articulates similar ideas applied to the British colonies in his pamphlet Common Sense. He argued that the colonists, by virtue of being bigger and having more resources, should not have to be owned and managed by a small island in Europe. The religious developments that occurred in the last period was the Great Awakening. It was a religious revival led to the creation of more Protestant sects, which led to a call of separation of church and state. This principle is present in the new state constitutions and eventually in the Bill of Rights, which provided for those same liberties. The Great Awakening was also significant in that it created a shared colonial identity in that all the colonies experienced the awakening together, listening to the same sermons from the same preachers that traveled throughout the colonies. For the societal developments that continue into the late 18th century, will limit the scope to the role of women in society and chattel slavery. Women's lack of legal rights under the system of coverture continue into this period to a large extent, though their mostly domestic role makes them incredibly important during the Revolutionary period. As the most effective way to protest British imperial taxes was through boycotts of British goods, the burden of producing substitute finished goods fell on women. It made their consent of the independence movement critical for its success, though ironically at the end of the revolution they are not granted a significant increase in rights. Only the state of New Jersey included language in its constitution that would allow women the right to vote, though it would be taken away in the first decade of the 19th century. Chattel slavery had risen in prevalence, especially in the southern British colonies, primarily due to economic reasons that were heavily influenced by geography. In this period, the northern and southern states will diverge as northern states implement gradual emancipation while southern states build in guarantees for the return of enslaved people who have run away. And a compromise to maintain unity during the Constitutional Convention will yield several clauses in the Constitution that guarantee the institution's existence into the early Republic and beyond, namely in the form of the Fugitive Slave Clause, the Three-Fifths Compromise, and the limitation on the regulation of the slave trade. The next concept says, after declaring independence, American political leaders created new constitutions and declarations of rights that articulated the role of the state and federal governments while protecting individual liberties and limiting both centralized power and excessive popular influence. This is to say that the colonists were rejecting strong centralized power. They were severing ties with a form of government that was a monarchy. Never mind that it was a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and less absolutist than its counterparts in Europe, they still perceived it as tyrannical. Therefore, in their efforts to establish new forms of government, they sometimes overcorrected in the opposite direction. Political leaders wanted a very decentralized form of government. That explains the structure of the Articles of Confederation. In the founding document, it describes the relationship of the states as being in a league of friendship, with each state being mostly sovereign of its own territory, while a very weak central government was barred from taxing, keeping a standing army, or legislating without near full consensus of each state. The U.S. Constitution and the state constitutions utilized the idea of separation of powers, which had been developed by the Enlightenment thinkers Montesquieu. They did so by creating multiple branches that held distinct powers and often were interdependent in creating policy. Requiring consensus of multiple branches made it more difficult for one faction or partisan group to gain control of all of the government. In terms of protecting individual liberties, state constitutions that were ratified by each state often had a Bill of Rights that came as a preface to the Constitution. Sometimes there were bills or laws that were written after the constitutions were adopted to explicitly guarantee certain rights. One of the most famous one is Virginia's Statute of Religious Freedom, which was written by Thomas Jefferson. It was something that he was so proud of that he actually put on his tombstone. The example that you are probably more familiar with is the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. They are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, and they were promised as a ratification compromise to political leaders who feared the Constitution created a government so strong that it could infringe on individual rights. The Bill of Rights were primarily drafted by James Madison, but amended and agreed upon by the first Congress. The next key concept is new forms of national culture and political institutions developed in the United States, alongside continued regional variations and differences over economic, political, social, and foreign policy issues. Now we're getting into the time period of the early republic. Washington is president, and he's followed by John Adams. One of the significant developments in political institutions is the creation of political parties. The first two political parties are the Federalist and the Democratic Republicans. Washington tries to stay above the fray of party politics despite the leaders of each party bickering within his cabinet. Thomas Jefferson led the Democratic Republicans, who favored a smaller, less intrusive central government, while Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, who favored a central government that could stimulate economic growth and commerce. Their viewpoints were similar to those in the constitutional ratification debates of the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. Party affiliation was not completely determined by geographic region, but the Federalist policies of higher tariffs often hurt southern states which relied primarily on agriculture and thus imported many of their finished goods. Alternatively, the areas in the north that were eager to start the path to industrialization favored Federalist policies that used the powers of the federal government to create a bank and possibly fund new transportation routes. The issue of slavery also caused regional variations in culture. The agrarian South relied on the institution and lobbied the government to create policies that would guarantee its continuity, while northern states began the path to emancipation. The first abolition society was formed in Pennsylvania and lobbied the first Congress to put an end to the institution before it grew further. The next key concept says migration within North America and competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensified conflicts among peoples and nations. At the beginning of the period, it was migrations and disputes of territory in the Ohio River Valley that paved the way for the American Revolution. After winning the French and Indian War, Britain tried to limit migrations into newly won territory to avoid wars against American Indian groups. Once independence is achieved, migrations west resume, but they are not without conflict with American Indians. Despite organizing the Northwest Territory for settlement under the Articles of Confederation, actual settlement would be difficult due to raids led by enemy chief Little Turtle. It wouldn't be until his defeat in 1795 through the Treaty of Greenville that the Northwest migration could be done in earnest. In this period, there are still other European powers in North America. The Spanish controlled the Louisiana Territory, awarded to them by Britain for helping fight the French in the 7 Years' War, and in their original colonial territory of the Southwest. The British are not fully expelled after the Revolutionary War. They retained territory in Canada, where French Canadians remained from when the territory changed hands following the French and Indian War, and where ex-loyalists were relocated after the Revolution. Finally, Britain was slow to vacate their western forts after the end of the Revolution, which made it harder for the new United States to claim that it could exercise sovereignty over all of their land claims. As you can see, through the end of the 18th century, the geopolitical landscape was not only crowded, but also not clear that any one nation could claim sovereignty over the entire continent. The next key concept says, in the decades after American independence, interactions among different groups resulted in competition for resources and shifting alliances and cultural blendings. So the three groups with which the United States has disputes with are Native Americans, the British, and the Spanish. With Native Americans, the United States continued to fight wars in the Northwest and Southwest. In the Northwest, it finally culminated with an American victory at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near the Ohio River. The peace was later settled by the Treaty of Greenville, and it gave Native Americans some territory in the far northwest so that American settlers could then occupy the territory that was being vacated. The treaty that was signed and adopted to define the borders with Spanish Florida was Pinckney's Treaty. It gave the United States navigation rights along the Mississippi River, so all of those new settlers that were settling down along the Ohio River Valley could use the Ohio River that then connects to the Mississippi River to send their goods and their crops downstream to be exported through the city of New Orleans. And finally, Jay's Treaty was with the British, and it was supposed to tie up loose ends from the Revolution. They wanted to remove the British troops who were still stationed out in the Northwest and to reestablish their trade relationship. The treaty was mostly written by Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay, who was the first Supreme Court Chief Justice, had been sent out to negotiate it. Because it reestablished this friendly relationship between the United States and Great Britain, the French, who were American allies, were really angered by this, and the Democratic Republicans, who wanted a closer relationship with the French, were also greatly angered by it. However, Britain was the stronger economic partner, and the absence of trade with them after the Revolution had caused a post-war recession that affected everyone. The final key concept is the continued presence of European powers in North America challenged the United States to find ways to safeguard its borders, maintain mutual trading rights, and promote its economic interests. As mentioned in a previous slide, despite the American victory and the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, British troops continued to occupy Western forts. It was impossible for the new United States to enforce those treaty provisions, so the British never left those forts, possibly waiting for the opportunity to regain the territory in a future war. It wasn't until Jay's Treaty that Britain began the process of vacating those forts in earnest. In terms of maintaining neutrality and promoting our economic interests, we are still wanting to keep friendly alliances with other European powers that are going to be trading partners. This becomes a problem during the Washington and Adams presidencies. During the Washington administration, the French Revolution had begun, and as a side effect of the beheading of the monarchs, France is invaded by its monarchical neighbors. The United States was allied with France since they helped fight the British in the Revolution. However, Washington made the decision to remain neutral in any European war for fear that the US would lose in a war and risk its independent status. In the Adams administration, the XYZ affair was a diplomatic fiasco that involved France. In this incident, American diplomats go over to France and they are treated poorly. They're asked for a bribe in order to be able to meet with the French foreign minister, so they come back in a public way refusing to engage in the bribe. The political cartoon that you see on the bottom right is a British cartoon that shows the French harassing the United States that is portrayed as Lady Columbia. It caused a diplomatic crisis between France and the United States, a short quasi-war out in seas, and it served to shift public opinion against the French, much to the dismay of Democratic Republicans. Alright, here is the recap for today. The 7 Years' War was fought over territory in North America against the British. British debt from the war led to a more active administration over the colonies. Colonist experience with self-government led to an independence movement as a rejection of British policies. The Articles of Confederation and state constitutions embodied Republican and Democratic ideals. And finally, conflicts with natives and Europeans continued into the early Republic. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click on the video link on the screen. And if you are looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit APUSHslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back on the next lecture.